Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for taking this very short course in world religions. In most universities and colleges that offer this class, these are the 8 world religions that are usually covered: Judaism, Hinduism, Shinto, Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Christianity, and Islam. And you can see there when they were started. And then on this graph, you'll get an idea of the world's population today. Roughly 32% would identify as Christian, another 23% as Muslim, and then Hinduism would account for 15%. And you can see the other divisions there. I usually begin a class by pointing out what it is not covering, and you can see here just under the very broad category of Christianity, we find 3 major divisions: Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and then Protestantism. You'll notice one other category, and that would be unorthodox sects. These are groups that, for one reason or another, do not identify under that label of Christian, although they do have many Christian elements within them. Notice under the Protestantism label, there are denominations, and just in the United States, there are literally thousands of denominations. For that reason, we barely scratch the surface just of what Christianity means in the broadest terms, and we do the same for the other religions as well. So it's a good idea to know up front that there's only so much we can cover, especially in a short course like this one. We'll begin, though, with Judaism. And these are the first of the 3 Western religions. The term Western religion is not strictly a geographical designation, but refers instead to those faiths that have most influenced Western culture. All 3, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are monotheistic because of their belief in one God, and they are sometimes called the Abrahamic traditions because all 3 of them embrace Abraham as one of their major patriarchs. Judaism can refer to a culture, an ethnicity, and a religious faith. Jews believe that there is one true God who created all things out of nothing, including human beings made in his image. This same God called Abraham and his descendants to be in a special relationship with him in accordance with a covenant which God initiated and by which Abraham would be given a great name, a land, and an entire nation. Eventually, Abraham's descendants multiplied, but they found themselves slaves in Egypt. God then sent a deliverer named Moses who told Pharaoh to let my people go. Following the 10 plagues, they made their way through the Red Sea and into the wilderness. Passover is a celebration of these events. In time, the children of Israel living in the Promised Land became a very powerful nation. Israel reached its zenith under the reign of King David around 1000 BC. But that united kingdom eventually crumbled under civil war and became the divided kingdom of Judah in the south and Israel in the north. A weakened Israel was then conquered by Assyria in 722 BC. Judah was conquered by Babylon in 586. During what is considered a reverse exodus, God drives out his own people, and the Babylonian exile begins. The story concludes with a remnant returning from Babylon to begin rebuilding the temple. Now, for each of the world religions that we'll take a look at, I've tried to come up with just one word that might summarize the central issue within that particular religion. With Judaism, that word would be covenant. The central issue as someone who is Jewish would be living in community as the chosen people of God according to his covenant with Abraham. Like Christians and Muslims, Jews believe that God has revealed his message through prophets, and especially through the law, the Torah, given to Moses. God reveals himself in the Hebrew Bible, which is made up of the law, the prophets, and the writings. but Christians refer to this as the Old Testament because they believe it has been completed or fulfilled in the New Testament. According to Christianity, God had promised, even from the very beginning, following the creation of Adam and Eve, to send a Messiah. The four Gospels, literally the good news, according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all claim that the messianic predictions, particularly in Isaiah, came true in Jesus of Nazareth. The term Christ means anointed one in Greek, and it is the Greek form of Messiah. Christians believe that in Christ, God had once again delivered his people in a more profound way than even Moses had. And this time, the whole world, Jews and Gentiles, meaning just non-Jews alike, would benefit from his work. The earliest Christian confessions, including those recorded by the Apostle Paul in the 1st century AD, profess a belief that Jesus was God in the flesh. The new covenant had been instituted through Jesus' sacrificial death on the cross and confirmed by his physical resurrection from the grave 3 days later. Central to Christian theology is the concept of grace. God graciously accomplishes for people what they are unable to attain for themselves: deliverance from Egyptian bondage through Moses, forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus, the Lamb of God. The one central issue within Christianity would be reconciliation. The essential Christian message is that Jesus achieved reconciliation between God and humanity through his death, burial, and resurrection, and his self-sacrifice made possible the forgiveness of sins and the promises of eternity in the presence of God. Muslims believe that in the early 7th century, Muhammad heard a call from God, Allah, which is the word for God in Arabic, to recite his revelation. Muhammad believed that the voice he heard was that of the angel Gabriel, and the collected sayings became known as the Quran. The Muslim profession of faith comes from this sacred book, and it states simply, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet." Islam teaches that Muhammad was the seal of the prophets, meaning that although God had revealed his words and his will through many who had come before, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, among others, the last word had now come through Muhammad, or simply the prophet. Many of the stories contained in the Quran are quite similar to those in both the Old and New Testaments, although there are significant differences as well. Muslims believe that even though many prophets had come prior to Muhammad, the message of Allah always managed to get lost in translation until he was given the final perfect revelation as it is written in the Quran. The one word that we would associate then with Islam is the word submission. It's what that word Islam actually means. The central issue within that religion is submission to the will of Allah through faithful observance of the 5 pillars of the faith. Now, before we turn to the Eastern religions, there's 4 questions that we ought to consider. 4 of the reasons why many Westerners find Eastern religions confusing. And here they are. Is it a religion or a philosophy? For example, Confucianism can be considered much more of a philosophy than it is actually a religion. It's a means to achieve social order. It was in the time of Confucius, and it may not have the same elements within it that some of the Western religions that might be more familiar do. Is it either or both and? To give you an example, I know someone who was raised in Japan, and he says it's very common for people to have a Shinto wedding and yet have a Buddhist funeral, and they see no real conflict in doing so. The reason is because Shinto answers particular questions in life, how to have an auspicious wedding, for example. How will I have good fortune as we begin our life together? And yet Buddhism answers different questions. What is the cause of death? What happens after death? What's the meaning of this short life that we live? So within Eastern religions in general, it might be said it's both and, not either or, in terms of a chosen religion. The third question to ask, is it about a personal God or gods, or an impersonal ultimate reality? And we'll find within Hinduism, if you study it further, that the answer is yes. It's both and, not either or. When within Hinduism mention is made of God, it's important to define terms, because it may well be, probably is, referring to something other than the creator God within Western religions, who stands apart from his creation. The fourth question to be asked, is the intellect a help or a hindrance to spiritual growth? Easterners looking at Western religions might observe that we tend to overthink things and don't realize that our intellect may be getting in the way of spirituality. Some Eastern religions may emphasize feelings and emotions, intuition, much more so than logical or reasonable thought. So we begin with Hinduism. And within Eastern religions, it's important to distinguish between monotheism, which most of them do not teach, except for Sikhism, and monism, the concept that everything is essentially one, which most of them do, including Hinduism. Although Hinduism in particular may be thought of as polytheistic, referring to a belief in many deities, and pantheistic, referring to a belief that God as an ultimate principle or force permeates all that is. The underlying principle of Hinduism, also known as Sanatana Dharma, or eternal path, may be summed up in a statement found in the Upanishads, the scriptures that date back to roughly 500 BC, and that statement is, that thou art. Atman is Brahman. It means that the individual soul, the inner self, Atman, is ultimately essentially one with absolute reality, or Brahman. To put that another way, the individual soul is identical to the cosmic soul of this divine universe. In Hinduism, the purpose of following a particular yogic path is to discover this central truth for oneself, and thus to experience self-realization. Central to Hinduism is the law of karma, or action, and reincarnation, the self continually entering a new life following death. The wheel of samsara, which is the accumulated effects of both good and bad karma, continues to turn. The goal of Hinduism is moksha, or liberation from further incarnations, and an eventual merging with Brahman. Now, within Hinduism, the term that might best describe that religion is self-realization. The central issue for a Hindu is release from the continual cycle of death and rebirth due to the law of karma and reincarnation by achieving self-realization of oneness with God. Atman is Brahman. After meditating under a sacred tree in India around 500 BC, Gautama Buddha is said to have reached enlightenment and discovered the Four Noble Truths. Life is suffering. Suffering is a result of desire. Suffering can be eliminated by eliminating desire. Desire can be eliminated by following the Noble Eightfold Path. Buddha was raised as a prince in a Hindu kingdom in India, but he later rejected much of that religion, such as priests, sacrifices, along with the sacred Vedic literature. Buddhism is considered the middle way, in between asceticism and self-indulgence. It may be thought of as almost a reform movement within Hinduism. Although it shares some beliefs in common with it, such as karma and reincarnation, Buddhism also teaches some distinctive doctrines, such as the concept of nirvana, as extinction of the individual personality. And it takes a generally agnostic view towards the existence of deities. The one word we might associate with Buddhism would be liberation. A Buddhist seeks liberation from suffering and attainment of nirvana by following the Noble Eightfold Path. Attempting to understand Chinese religions begins with grasping the concept of qi, which is thought to be a sort of life-giving energy or force that permeates the universe. The familiar yin-yang symbol of Taoism represents the two sides of the eternal force at work. Yin is considered to be the dark female side, yang is the light male side. Wisdom requires living in accordance with this essential harmony, the Tao, or the Way, by observing Wu Wei, or non-action. According to legend, Lao Tzu dictated the Tao Te Ching as he left society behind around 500 BC or so. The one word we would use to describe Taoism would be harmony. What Taoism is about is living in harmony with the underlying creative principle of the universe, in other words, the Tao, symbolized by yin and yang. Living in harmony is also a major theme within Confucianism. Master Kung, or Confucius, in other words, is thought to have been a contemporary of Lao Tzu. Faced with a society in chaos, Confucius taught that the solution was to live in harmony with the mandate of heaven through the conscientious practice of virtue. Confucianism might be as much a political and social philosophy as it is a religious perspective. The word we would associate with Confucianism would be propriety, properly observing rituals and respecting social codes, the mandate from heaven, so as to bring order out of chaos, and seeking to actualize the human ideal of Zen. Up until fairly recently, Shinto was geographically limited almost exclusively to Japan. It has to do with acknowledging the kami that surround us, the spirits of ancestors, of mythic heroes, and of the natural world, mountains, trees, rocks. Shinto shares that in common with other animistic religions. Followers of Shinto will be concerned with ritual purity and will often rinse their mouths at special shrines. Shinto underwent a major shift following World War II. Up until that time, the Emperor of Japan had been considered a deity. Following Japan's defeat, Emperor Hirohito officially declared himself to be a mere human being. The word that we would associate with the religion of Shinto would be veneration. Revering spirits in the natural world, in other words, the kami, and honoring ancestors so as to maintain the roots Japanese people have with their ancient history and mythology. So that's the big picture of the major world religions. I hope it's been helpful. I've been teaching this subject for over 20 years now, and I have found that there is a way with further study to become more confident in my faith and also more considerate of my religious neighbors. I hope you have that same experience. Thanks again for taking part in this mini course. By all means, if I can be of any help at all, please feel free to email me here. You can also look at my website at worldreligions101.com. Thank you again.